When Canadian Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire commanded United Nations forces during the genocide in Rwanda, few beyond the military were aware of the severe psychological damage that witnessing such moral atrocities can cause. Dallaire's revelation that he suffered from PTSD and moral injury in the Rwandan conflict helped destigmatize these potentially devastating mental conditions among military veterans. It also helped us understand how all of us can experience moral injury in our daily lives. As we live through the aftershocks of a global pandemic, racial injustice, and the rise of extremist violence around the world, there's no better time to have a conversation about trauma, recovery, and moral courage. How do we build resilience, collective hope? How can we embrace humanity and human connection? Join the conversation as we work together to build upon General Dallaire's call for transformative change and an engaged approach to leadership in the face of moral dilemmas.
Hello and welcome or welcome back. My name is Dr. Eric Vermetten. I am a psychiatrist and a professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And I'm a military officer in the Dutch Armed Forces. And I'm joined with my co-host, Dr. Suzette Brémault-Phillips. Hello, Suzette.
Hi, Eric.
How are you?
Great to see you, Eric. Doing well,
in
thank
a
you.
different time zone. We're 8 hours apart. I am in the Netherlands and Suzette is in
Edmonton, Alberta, Canada.
Okay. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th of the Cleveringa Dallaire Critical Conversation Sessions. This one is on destigmatizing the impact of trauma and PTSD. We were pleased with the overwhelmingly positive reviews of the first 5 sessions. And we are again so excited that people from more than 27 countries today are represented with us. And I'll read them because they're wonderful countries to be represented and be with us: from Australia, Belgium, Belize, Brazil, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Canada, Finland, Germany, Guatemala, India, Italy, Japan, Kenya, Malaysia, Mexico, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nigeria, Portugal, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Spain, Turkey, Ukraine, United Kingdom, and the United States. So welcome all from all over the world. So this webinar is the 6th of 8 conversations honoring the Cleveringa chair that was awarded to Romeo Dallaire. And it's called, today's called Destigmatizing the Impact of Trauma and PTSD. So born in the Netherlands, General Dallaire is a celebrated Canadian who has exemplified moral courage, the key focus of the Cleveringa professorship.
During this series, General Dallaire and esteemed colleagues will reflect with us on issues related to complex, ambiguous moral and ethical dilemmas, these times overshadowed by issues associated with the global pandemic, climate change, gender-based violence, racialization, and threats of terror, are a call to truth and reconciliation. They also highlight the need for engaged leaders who embrace humanity and can truly inspire and actualize transformative culture change. This series aims to provide a context for such a conversation. Eric?
So before we start, we like to note a few things. General Dallaire's experience is the thread that weaves these sessions together. The conversations will often go back to the themes of his experience. And we're grateful that General Dallaire will be joining us for this session. And he will continue to join us through November 10th in the honor, that's our last session of Remembrance Day. Now, each session, as you may have seen from the previous ones, is 90 minutes long. Apologize. You registered and you received a live stream specific for this session. If you now wish to follow all of the conversations, you will need to register for each separate event. Please also share the link and the event with colleagues, friends, and post them on social media if you like.
We're also aware that some of the content, the conversations may be difficult to hear or trigger past experiences and memories. We encourage you to honor yourself and your experience and seek local supports and services if needed. We'd also love to hear your questions and comments. You can share your thoughts by using the questions or remarks box on the Leiden's events page. We will do our best to address questions posted. And finally, the sessions will be recorded and made available following the event on the Leiden University events page. Before we start, we're going to just do a bit of a land acknowledgement from the...
Hello, I am Tammy Hopper, Interim Dean of the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine, home to Highmark at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. When we acknowledge territory, such as we do at the beginning of a meeting like this one, it is a small but important act of reconciliation. And thus, on this day, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on the traditional territory of Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe nations, lands that are now known as part of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations. Thank you for listening and joining me in this moment of reflection.
So, since we have the General with us, Romeo Dallaire, dear General, may I ask you to share with us some opening remarks on the topic of today? May I please give you the word?
Thank you ever so much, Professor Eric, and also to Dr. and Professor also Suzette for sustaining the effort so far through all these 5 sessions and now the 6th one, as we took this quite ambitious objective of looking at moral injuries and psychological injuries of those who serve, not only in our military forces, although there was a lot of emphasis, but also in our first responders and in a number of areas in society as a whole. I'm particularly, I'm humbled by the presence, in fact, of Madame Maalla, the UN Special Representative to the Secretary General on Violence Against Children, her work and the efforts that the Institute of the Dallaire Institute of Children, Peace and Security are actually making significant inroads, and we're very glad to hear from her. And to colleagues who have served in uniform, have now gone to academia and are doing research and now have all doctoral things, and I'm still working on my BSc that I barely passed. I think I graduated last or next to last in my class. So I'm not going to use the academic dimensions of this experience, only to say that I am very proud of the work that you have continued to pursue. And lastly, I wanted, as I mentioned earlier on offline, is that I have been for over 20 years under the protection, I nearly say at times, certainly in the first years, of Dr. Matthew Friedman, who was the head of the PTSD clinics for the Veterans Affairs in the United States, stationed at White River Junction, Vermont, where I'm there now, really, and has become a great support and mentor to the efforts. In regards to content, ladies and gentlemen, thanking you for joining us, because it is the first essential step in moving the yardsticks in attempting to not only grasp the operational stress injury of PTSD that many of our members have suffered, but also it is the first step in them actually getting the support that they really need to be able to live in a reasonable fashion, probably not like before, but certainly as close as you can be to reasonable, with the therapy, with the medication where required, and also with the peer support. But to get them to acknowledge this was a horrific battle, as it has been after every campaign, particularly in the military world where we're so Darwinian and we are so visual. Such injuries as PTSD were not evident, and it sort of affected directly the ability for leaders and key colleagues to accept that one of theirs has actually been injured, but not physically, but in fact mentally, although there are physical consequences, of course, to our brain. Now, this reticence of wanting to recognize this injury had to be broken because the stigma of being injured in such a way all the way back, and I remember veterans of World War II. My father was injured in World War II, and it was a horrible youth and way of life to live in a family with someone injured that bad in war. In Korea, I was serving with veterans who had lived that experience, and although somebody injured physically, they were looked at and respected, and a certain deference was demonstrated to them because their bodies had been affected overtly by injuries. But those who were psychologically affected, those who had the operational stress injuries of PTSD, they tended always to be in the backdrop and trying to hide between the paint and the wall at times, as they demonstrated often a demeanor that was nasty, aggressive, and very isolated. And so how do we bring them into the fold? Well, certainly when I went public in 1997 and said that I was injured, and there was no doubt in my military mind that I was significantly injured, it caused quite a ripple that a two-star general at the time would indicate that because of his command, he would be psychologically injured. And that to me was not only very helpful for my own ultimate stabilization of my state of mind, but also to influence others to come forward, both commanders, both officers, NCOs, and other ranks, to realize that there is no such thing as someone being immune to circumstances that could create this injury, and that they could fall victim to this injury, as it is with an ambush or any other type of military operation. This can actually happen. And so it did take, and I have to recognize, well over 3 years for me even to accept that I was injured. And then in the 4th year, I became close to comatose for about 7 months as I isolated and, in fact, totally turned off to the world, as I was simply with a teleprompter day in and day out reliving every moment of the Rwandan genocide and of my command. So I was able, thanks to opening the door, that it was honorable to be injured psychologically, just as honorable as being injured physically. It was not a dishonor, it was honorable. What did, however, create enormous amount of problems in trying to bring the systems in which all our military forces, the medical systems, the leadership structure, and the acknowledgement of such injuries that we could, with better training and better capabilities, prevent or at least reduce the impacts and even get at the injury earlier. What was the biggest problem after attacking the stigma and making it an honorable operational stress injury to which soldiers could respond to honorably and felt that, was getting the actual support. Now we've built MASH, and there are colleagues here who have served in military medical structures, who will speak later. And we built MASH and MASH capabilities and Role 3 hospitals and so on. And the rate of saving lives is off the chart, 98 or something %. Where's the MASH for the psychological injury? Where is that same sense of urgency to get inside that head early and be able to attenuate the growing impact of this injury that ultimately makes it just that much more difficult to be able to resolve and ultimately to help? And so, ladies and gentlemen, this subject is of significance, not only to those members who we're serving, but it is of enormous significance to their families, because their families are literally living hell. I've lived it, and now we even see children of injured members who are so discouraged and living such a turbulent way of life with a member who's hurting with this type of injury that they have given up and are actually committing suicide. So we're picking casualties now of not only the members, but their families. Ladies and gentlemen, your efforts have been recognized. You're on this panel. We're anxious to hear from you in the discussion, and we're very proud of all of you to be involved and looking at the sources of the injury, but also the recognition that it is an honorable injury. It's not a disease, and it can affect any one of us, depending on the circumstances in which we serve. And so to you, Eric and Suzette, I hand over, and you got the short version here. So I'm doing everything I can to be brief. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that disclosure and for your openness and willingness to share. And I vividly can remember, General, that Shaking Hands with the Devil, looking at that documentary from the Netherlands, me being a young psychiatrist, had a deep impact on me, how then this general could also suffer from PTSD. And it paved the way for all other soldiers who then were struggling to also come out and disclose what they were suffering from. So thank you for sharing. And maybe we'll entertain a few questions with you as long as you're with us. But yes, for now, I'd like to briefly bring it to Suzette, and then we'll start with the panel and the introduction of the panel.
So as a beginning to this, we look forward today to further leveraging what the General has offered as some key opening remarks, and look forward to engaging with each of the panelists and moderators about the ideas that you've both shared and a conversation that will be moderated by Dr. Eric Vermetten. So Eric, I'd like to, with great pleasure, ask you if you can offer some opening introductory remarks, introduce yourself
yes,
in a broader way, and also the panelists. Eric, if I could pass.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to be the moderator of today's sessions. I've hosted the sessions before, but moderator is another chapter. So PTSD continues, as we heard the General say, continues to be a difficult topic for individuals and for communities. So the central theme that we discussed today is stigma and PTSD. As a central question is, how do we destigmatize this condition that we call PTSD and help people recover and minimize the impact? So we will talk about various angles to this question. Well, what is actually stigma? Well, it involves a negative attitude or a discrimination against someone based on a distinguishing characteristic such as mental illness, a health condition, or disability. Social stigma can also be related to other characteristics, including gender, sexuality, race, religion, and culture. So we will talk about this and how to destigmatize this condition we label as PTSD, and helping recovery and minimize the impact. Now, please allow me to welcome the esteemed panelists. After a brief introduction, I will set the stage for today's conversation. First, I will ask the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, their name and affiliations for the audience. May I please ask Dr. Najat Maalla Majid. Please, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, sure. I am Najat Maalla Majid. I am the special representative of the SG on violence against children, and I am pediatrician, and I am from Morocco and currently based in New York. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and glad to have you with us. The next one that I would like to allow him to introduce himself is Dr. Retired Colonel Rakesh Jetly. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks very much, Eric. Rakesh Jetly, I'm a retired military psychiatrist, just retired after 31 years as the senior psychiatrist of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm still involved in many things. I'm in Ottawa, the University of Ottawa, doing research and still trying to sort of forward the yardstick for the treatment of PTSD and related conditions.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Rakesh. And the next is Professor Retired Colonel Robert Ursano. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Eric and Suzette. And I'm Bob Ursano, and I'm professor of psychiatry and neuroscience. I'm a psychiatrist by training, and I'm at the Uniformed Services University, which is the federal military medical school in the United States, located in Bethesda, Maryland, where I direct our Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress.
Thank you. Thank you. And the next one on the panel is Professor Retired Captain Alexander McFarlane, who cannot introduce himself since he was unable to be with us today. Sandy McFarlane is the director of the University of Adelaide's Center for Traumatic Stress Studies and an international expert in the field of impact of disasters and post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, he had surgery recently and felt that he was unfit to be live with us. So in a sort of a replacement of his physical presence, he sent us a video that we'd like to share with you, and that sets the stage then for the discussion amongst the panelists. If I may please ask to start the video of Alexander Sandy McFarlane.
Colonel Vermetten asked if I would also address another issue that he and I have been working on, and I think is a very important one in developing our understandings of post-traumatic stress disorder and its treatment. We've now benefited from several decades of excellent longitudinal research, and I think this has done much to give us a better sense of how PTSD develops. When it first was part of clinical practice, there was a belief that people's maximal distress and symptoms were in the immediate aftermath of events. What we've found is, particularly in groups such as veterans who've had multiple trauma exposures, that in fact PTSD is a condition that develops and progresses with time. And I think this is one of the reasons why stigma is often such a challenge. Initially, people start off with relatively minor symptoms that then are triggered and magnify themselves progressively. Also, often their difficulties become apparent through their irritability and apparent struggles in their relationship with others. So it's always easy to externalise and blame the relationships and the behaviour of others. The real challenge is to be introspective. So what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder is that people go through a secondary stage of subsyndromal post-traumatic stress disorder. This is subclinical symptoms, but we know they're almost as disruptive as the full-blown disorder. Then there's the point where somebody actually fully develops the condition. Now, the importance of stigma is that we have got to make sure that people get treated as early as we can for a number of reasons, particularly what we know about the neurobiology, that the longer somebody has a disorder, the more likely it is to become chronic. A range of neurobiological changes become entrenched. The disorder increasingly erodes people's social networks and disrupts their capacity to function and their behaviours, so that with the passage of time, there is an increasing alienation. And often it's at that point that stigma is the major challenge to seeking care. As the disorder progresses, particularly if people become treatment non-responsive, they then develop a whole series of secondary comorbidities that we know a lot more about with PTSD. These are not only conditions such as major depressive disorder and substance abuse, and a whole range of specific physical symptoms like pain, respiratory symptoms, cardiac symptoms, but increasingly there are a whole range of autoimmune diseases, gastrointestinal dysfunction that we need to address. And I think it's a particular challenge at that point that we get people to have a holistic view of their symptoms, and to understand that PTSD is not just about a state of mind. It's about a state of their whole physiological adaptation. And this is where I think psychoeducation and having a conceptual model of the disease is of particular value to explaining to people how treatment can and will assist them.
So that was Professor Alexander McFarlane, that we will refer to as Sandy. We agreed that we call all of the panelists by first names. And let me please return now to you, Najat. I will do my best to balance all of you in your speaking time. Najat, we've just heard some initial comments from Professor McFarlane, Sandy, about today's topic. Now, could you help us and what strikes you about his remarks, and maybe particularly because of your central topic of your interest is how this particular regards in ways which they apply to child soldiers? Please.
Yes, I think regarding just to react to the comment made by Captain McFarlane, if I am not wrong in spelling his name, I think regarding my mandate is child soldier, but is more wider than child soldiers. And I think it's also about all children victims of violence during conflict, but also outside conflict. And he was highlighting all the stigma that surround, the mental health and PTSD. And I think what is really important is becoming child soldier is a violence against children, just to never forget. This is very important. And its impact also children's mental health. And it also harm deeply the mental well-being. And this is really important to take into account. Another point that we need to take into account that despite the fact that when we are speaking about children in armed conflict or children in humanitarian settings, they are facing a continuum of violence. It could be physical, it could be sexual, it could be emotional. But also what is important is to take into account this continuum of violence. This is very important. And in the same time, what is important is to take into account the impact and the long-lasting impact on children that is not duly taken into account. And it could be immediate, but also long-term, as already highlighted by the captain. And I think another thing that it's important is regarding also this the stigma that surround, all mental health. And I think it's really very, very, very important to take into account all these issues. And stigma is, as he highlights, is a problem also of knowledge, of attitude, of behavior, and it can both cause and exacerbate mental health difficulties and block children from seeking help. This is very, very important. And mainly when you are involved, in armed conflict, when you are trafficked, when you are in closed, spaces, when you are in an institution where you are detained. So the violence is really impacting. And what we heard from also consultation done with children, that they feel the rejection, the harsh judgment, the misunderstanding, the misinformation and discrimination associated with stigma about mental health, it sometimes be more disadvantageous than the condition itself. And this is really important. And also I think what is important is also many children under 18 remain silent and left to deal with self-stigma and poor self-esteem alone. This is very important. And also what I think it's important, that stigma can combine with other stresses, as you highlighted, such as discrimination based on race, on gender, on socioeconomic status, on disability, on sexual orientation, or personal history, or to drive poor mental health. And stigma that it's really important to take into account can also be structural, as it influences laws, policies, attitudes, and cultural norm. And it violates human rights, and in the case, children's rights. And examples include laws and policies that limit the freedoms of people with mental health condition, and media depictions that perpetuate stereotypes. So it's really important if we need, and this is one of my main big advocate points, that we need to invest in mental well-being and in mental health of children, sure, in all settings, taking into account all this impact, but in the same time, using also building back better from the pandemic as an opportunity, because the pandemic showed us that, you know, mental health was a neglected area, and currently showed us that really we need to invest in it in a very substantive way, but not only on services, but also in prevention, and mainly in really breaking, you know, this stigma. This is very important to do it, because if you are not breaking the stigma, but through education, through using social platform, fighting misinformation, providing also a way for children, safe pathway to speak up, and also to highlight what they are feeling. And what is important is to empower children and young people as experts and as key actors and part of the solution, because worldwide, and it will be my last word, we are seeing more and more children speaking up, mobilizing themselves, providing support and raising their concern. And we need to involve them as key actors of the solution and not as passive recipients of services. Over to you, Eric.
No, thank you for these words, these initial words. And Najat, if I listen to you, I see behind you this call zero violence against children by 2030. And this speaks as a call to action as well. Could you just comment on, like, what do we need to do to achieve that goal that is just behind your right shoulder?
I think, you know, when we are speaking about achieving, you know, ending violence against children by 2030, we cannot achieve violence against children if we are not achieving all the other SDGs related to poverty, to discrimination, to access to health, to mental health and well-being, to education, to fight, you know, all this social injustice, to fight also what we were speaking about, stigma, but also to make sure that really children are really seen as part of the solution. This is one, to build a resilient, you know, society. And if we need to build resilient society, we need to build and to empower human beings to become resilient. And it has to start at early age. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for these initial comments and a call to action that I hear from your words. Now let me go over to Rakesh. Rakesh, we've known each other for almost 2 decades now. We've been together at many places, conferences, NATO meetings, and collaborated on a range of topics from PTSD to moral injury, and we became friends, right? I'd like to entertain to you is where do the comments from Sandy and Najat lead you now in general, and
Well, I think
more specifically, and you may relate to that also because the general referred to that earlier, related to also your military experience and perhaps including one of your deployments in 1993 with the General Romeo Dallaire in Rwanda. Would you?
Yeah. Well, Eric,
what are your thoughts?
Thanks very much for inviting me in. I mean, this is virtual, but again, just to be with you and to be with Bob and Sandy and you know, new friends. I mean, our conversations sort of go all over the place. And when you asked me to talk about this, like what often occurs, simultaneous things come into my mind, right? And really, you know, Op Passage, which was our sort of humanitarian medical mission in '94 in Rwanda, where, you know, a bunch of us medical folks, I was a young doctor at the time, a captain, went to help with the refugees, and General Dallaire did visit us. And as a young captain, not a psychiatrist yet, I just remember he looked tired. You know, that image struck. They came off the helicopter, they visited. I was in the back. I wasn't in charge or anything, but he just looked tired. And it's sort of interesting later on that we heard a little bit more. The other thing that pops into my mind when you talk about stigma, and you asked me, an old friend who passed away a few years ago that you and I both knew, Mark Zamorsky.
Right.
You know, Mark, the scientist, brilliant guy. And I remember years ago having the discussion about stigma. And he said, Rakesh, you know, stigma is an ism. It's bad. it's wrong. We're talking about social stigma, public stigma. It's endorsing negative stereotypes, prejudice as a form of discrimination. But how it matters to us in the healthcare system is how it can be a barrier to care, right? And I think that's a really important thing. There's self-stigma as well, which I think is even more difficult, where people don't show themselves the kindness that they would show somebody else. And quite often with patients, we struggle with that. There's structural stigma, where institutions have systems set up, and we, I remember back in the day, the psych ward in a hospital was always in the old part of the building, and dirty, and kind of the creaky old elevator, and where does health funding go? Mental health is the #1 cause of disability in the Western world, of around 3 to 5% of the spending on research. So I think there's different kinds of stigma, and I think it's important for us. General Dallaire also said that the first step is the stigma, and I agree with him there, in the other sense of, I am an optimist in the sense that I think things are getting better. In a career that started, when we went to Rwanda, there was no thought about mental illness. There was no mental health professionals with us. We were sort of quote unquote knee deep in body parts the whole time. We came back, no education, no debriefing, no screening, and I think, thanks to people like him, we have gone in concrete ways, accepting the term operational stress injury to sort of, structurally put into place this idea that, people get blown up, you could lose a limb, you could have mental illness, it's a legitimate injury. Tangible things like our sacrifice medal, where, if somebody has a psychological injury, they're entitled to sort of Canadian Purple Heart because of this injury. So any opportunities we had to tangibly recognize these as injuries, I think it's gone a long way. We've put in systems where we think about the multimodal way of treating this. If you screen everybody that comes back from deployment, you're not putting the people on the spot to raise their hand, right? So then every single person, so that's destigmatizes the idea where we're going to screen you medically. Did you hurt yourself physically? We're also going to screen you psychologically. How are things going at home and family? So I'm optimistic in the sense that it's a journey, and I think we're well on the way. We'll never be finished. It's like fitness. It's like lots of other things. But I think we've done, certainly in our militaries and within NATO, we have done lots of things where we're tangibly putting these physical injuries on a footing with the physical injuries, and I think that's important. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to engage in further.
Well, just one follow-up question to you. Then we heard the general say it's an honorable disease. Those were the words that I feel that I would like to echo back or circle back to you. Yeah. How would you relate to that?
Well, I mean, again, as a person that's literally months past his retirement, I can give you an anecdote. In about 2002, 2003, I gave a briefing. I gave a briefing where the psychiatrist stood up, talked about it on an army base, and before the commanding officer introduced me and kind of said, "Hey, it's time for our touchy-feely bubble bath talk. Here comes the doc," right? And it was a bit awkward because about 15 people in the audience were my patients, so I felt bad for them, not for me. And again, there's a stigma against mental health professionals as well. And I gave my talk, and then spontaneously at the end of it, he stood up and he said, "Hey, I apologize for my comments at the beginning. This is really important," right? So that was 10 years after Rwanda. Fast forward now, in the last 3 or 4 years, when I give a talk, quite often the commanding officers themselves will stand up. The base commander will stand up and talk about how they might have had a mental health difficulties. They reached out, they got help. And, chief warrant officer of one of the large army bases, the RSM, stood up and said, I used to think that the courageous people were the ones that sort of sucked it up. Now I think the courageous people are the ones that stand up. So saying the right things, doing the right things, I think we're there. I don't think we're ever going to be finished. But I do believe that, we've turned in the sense of, of the corner of, it's honorable, you can wear a medal. Veterans Affairs recognizes these as injuries. I think we need to step it up and get better treatments, and that's going to be part of how we go in scientifically. But I think that when you reduce the stigma, you also increase the pressure on the system to treat these illnesses. And And that's the work left for us and people that follow us.
Thank you. We'll dive into these treatments as we progress in our panel, I think. But thank you, Rakesh. Let's turn now to Robert Ursano, Bob. Bob, in your rich experience serving as the director of a highly successful Center for Traumatic Stress, there's always such rich wisdom in your contributions that you're sharing. I know I'm raising expectations by saying that, but what are your ideas regarding today's topic?
Thank you, Eric and Suzette, and thank you, Rakesh and Najat, and of course, General Dallaire. It's a pleasure to be here. Firstly, an image keeps coming to mind to me, which I will share because I think it touches both Najat and Rakesh's comments. In the world of COVID, one of our topics was always, how does one approach children? And we created a graphic, and the graphic showed a family. But in the second stage of the graphic, it showed a parent talking with the child. But the most important piece of that graphic was that the parent had gone down to be at the level of the child. In other words, they were either kneeling or sitting so they could look the child in the eye. Now, why does that come to mind is what I kept asking myself. And I think it is in part because stigma separates us. And the biggest challenge is how to be with someone. And to be with them, it requires us to be at the same level, to be able to look in their eyes, to be able to hear them before we speak to them. And those are the actions that I think comprise much of what becomes how do we lessen stigma at the individual level. Having said that, I kind of tucked that away in my head, and I wanted to make some broader comments. And in some ways, I think this fits in a bit of a 3x3 matrix. So when I think of stigma, there are three areas. One is the self, the individual, in which we are always trying to perform within the rules we set for ourselves and achieve the ideals that we set for ourselves. And stigma is we have violated that. And then there is the realm of culture, which as a child, that means our family. As adults, it may include where we work. It may include our community. It certainly includes our military community. And how our culture establishes stigma or protects us from it. And thirdly is what others, and I borrow from them, in particular, Oscar Cabrera, who works in our center, the concept of spiritual elements of stigma. And by spiritual, many would think of religious, would fall in that category. But for those who aren't religious, it also contains the picture of how we see ourselves joining the stream of history and the way in which history carries us forward in our destination, and that we can violate our sense of being a part of that river as well. So those three I keep in mind. And then the other three that I would again make this 3x3 box. I'm not sure where it would go, but I may play with that after this conference to see where we go. That stigma also has three components. One, it's an action. We frequently call it stigmatizing, but where are we stigmatizing, and where do we stigmatize at the individual? Where do we stigmatize a family? Where do we stigmatize by the way in which we see our participating in the morals and values of our community? And then there's the part of the experience of stigma, which of course includes isolation, withdrawal, separation. The sense of hating ourselves is a primary component of stigma, and the sense of sadness. And how can we disrupt that as part of dealing with stigma? And lastly, of course, is our systems that we build and how we can build rules in our systems that create stigma by the way in which we establish laws, the way in which we give awards, the way in which we punish can establish a way in which we are stigmatizing people. So in order to deal with stigma, which is so prominent, I think we're going to have to attack it in each one of these boxes. We're going to have to attack the individual level, the cultural level, the systems level. We're going to have to deal with how we stigmatize. We're going to have to deal with, of course, at the individual level as psychiatrists, Rakesh and Eric and Suzette as well. We worry about the psychological components and how do we deal with those? And then how do we change our systems that have rules built into them, formal and informal, that can stigmatize soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, as well as others in our nations and in the world, who should have the opportunity to maximize their sense of who they want to be, rather than feel that they have to pull inside and hide inside a shell with a coat over their heads because they don't belong or they don't feel they are a part of these larger communities in which we all live. So Eric, many thoughts. I think how we change it is the real question, and which targets are there rather than just stigma. We've got to tackle it in its pieces and parts at the individual level, within families and culture, and within our systems. And we're going to have to change things. It's a hard road. It has been begun. I much appreciate Rakesh and Sandy's comments earlier about it's been ongoing now for some time. Even the establishment of the diagnosis of PTSD was a move away from some of the stigma contained when in fact nothing could be named, but it's a long road. Look forward to the discussion, Eric and Suzette.
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and thank you for those initial comments when you said of primary importance, you got to be with somebody, you've got to hear before you speak. I think that's true wisdom, and thank you for that leveling and that image that kept coming back to you, right? And I was just playing with the thought, actually a couple of years, there was a 4-star general that spoke at the American Psychiatric Association. And maybe you could speak what happened. You know what that brief is. Could you describe to the audience what happened there?
Yes, it was a phenomenal event, and it was at the time of pretty much the height of the Iraq-Afghanistan war, in which the issues which remain true of suicide in particular in our military in the United States remain quite high. Prior to the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, the rates of suicide were lower in our military than in our civilian population. And since 2004, they have gone up beyond that of comparable age and gender match samples. And the general from the Marines came to the American Psychiatric Association and literally stood before, gave his talk, but began and ended it saying, I am here to ask for your help. I need help. My soldiers and Marines need your help. We ask you to help us heal our wounds and find ways to go forward. A phenomenal experience, phenomenal.
So thank you for sharing. So thank you all for setting the stage and for your initial comments. And please, if you wanted to comment, Najat or Rakesh, on what you just heard, or additional thoughts before we go actually to another video that I will postpone if some comments will emerge, a second video by Sandy McFarlane that we can entertain a little bit later. But please share your comments or ideas about this, what you just heard so far. Najat or Rakesh, just chime in if you wish. Yeah, Najat.
Yes, I just want to, I think I am the only one who has not a military background. Anyway, just I want to highlight also the PTSD and all these traumas that affect children. You know, children in armed conflict, children in refugee camps. And we know the worst condition currently in Syria, in Iraq. You have also all these children associated with armed groups or affected by also terrorist group or associated to foreign fighters. We have all the return of these children, and this is amazing. And we need really to start thinking about also, when we are speaking about rehabilitation, how we can also fight the stigma of all the communities and all the other system as highlighted by Robert. It's a system, a socio-ecological system, and we need to tackle it because we are facing really what children are living currently due to that. It's amazing. And currently, it's a big political issue, and we need more and more also to start seeing, you know, the PTSD and all the trauma and all the stigma, not only from the how we can build bridges between the work is done under the military, but also all the other civilian aspects. I think it's really important, and to use this big opportunity currently to put it in the political agenda and to really move forward if we need really to face that and to stop that. Because just I want to remind you that according to the last report made by UNICEF on mental health, you know, you have one adolescent that dies from suicide every 11 minutes worldwide. Just to let you know, and this it's really impacting. Over to you.
No, a follow-up question that was on my mind, and also to ask you, Najat, and refer back to what you have behind you. There's a boy and a girl, right, on that. Is there any difference in how to regard children from a sex perspective, boys versus girls, or is that something that you could comment on? Is there any gender specificity or to this topic?
Depending about what kind of violence, effectively, you know that sexual violence is affecting, you know, in armed conflicts, in humanitarian setting, mainly girls than boys. It becomes a kind of, you know, weapon, you know, war weapon, and it's used, you know, really to destroy the community. And you have many children who are born from this rape, and this it's huge. Right. And you have in Iraq, the Yazidi community, girls who were raped by the others are really excluded by their own family because they have this kind of having shame, and when they have babies, and it's awful. So just to let you know. But you have also, what is really important, many boys also who are victims of various forms, including sexual violence, but they didn't speak about it. Why? Because it's shame, because it's taboo. And I want to remind you that the terrorist groups in the recruitment also use violence, use sexual violence against boys and girls to recruit them, and use discrimination to recruit them. So we need really to make sure that we are taking into account all this impact on children, the youth, to make sure that we are fighting that is in a systemic approach, and this is very important. Over to you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you for those additional comments. Rakesh or Bob, you want to chime in on what you heard thus far?
Yeah, no, I really like what I'm hearing. I mean, clearly we understand, and you know, as somebody that's been in places like Rwanda, the Middle East, Afghanistan, I mean, you just have to look outside of your vehicles and you see that the impact of war is certainly not limited to members of the armed forces. And in fact, the members of the armed forces, going back to Western countries where we have treatment, you know, in many ways, are more fortunate than the others. I remember a NATO meeting in Istanbul, and I think there was something to the effect of 2 million refugees in the streets of Istanbul. So absolutely, and as a country like Canada, our refugee population comes in, and it again goes back to the treatment where they come to a safe country. We maybe look after them in terms of shelter, safety, and food, but many of them are haunted by things. And about 3 or 4 months ago, I actually met a young lady from Rwanda that was, you know, maybe 11 years old when I was there. So yeah, I think the echoes and the effects of these are there. And again, from a structural perspective, we need to make sure that we have the care available for them when they do return to, or are able to get out of some of the dangerous settings they're in.
Okay, before we go to the video, yes, Bob, maybe you unmuted, so you wanted to speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment to be sure that we captured the important role of leadership in this task. That Leaders establish the tone of communities. They say what is acceptable, and they also provide forgiveness. All of those are important tasks in deterring stigma and preventing stigma. The way in which a sentence or a phrase is built can alter an entire way in which a community approaches people and a problem, and leaders are the ones that frame those for us and help guide us as we go forward.
I would like to touch more on these topics when you spoke about spiritual, and now you're raising the topic of forgiveness in terms of leaders. Maybe we could reflect back on that after the video that we've heard from Sandy McFarlane's video number 2, and that actually also sets up for the stage of treatment. And let's play the second video with the contribution of Sandy McFarlane.
I would like to address the issue of stigma and post-traumatic stress disorder and how we might address this, because it is such a fundamentally important issue in terms of what stops people from seeking treatment and assistance when this is clearly going to be of benefit to them. The first thing we shouldn't forget is that we know that mental illness in the broader community does carry significant stigma. And one of the interesting things about post-traumatic stress disorder was that when it was first introduced into the DSM system, it was very much welcomed by veterans because it did much to destigmatize some of the other ways in which they had been previously characterised with constructs such as lack of moral fibre amongst airmen in World War II. The trouble is that there are still I guess, natural barriers. And a number of important programs, I think, have gone a long way to assist in undoing much of that external stigma through psychoeducation programs such as TRIM in the UK forces, Battlemind in the US and Canada, and has been also adopted in Australia. And also what we've found in Australia is that screening people on return from deployment and 6 months later, and particularly if they were deploying again, and having contact with a mental health professional does much to teach them a language and a way of speaking of their symptoms and difficulties. But I think the really important part of stigma is that of self-stigma. And I think this is a much more challenging and difficult one to confront. We know that people in the military are people who, by temperament, know how to suppress fear, they know how to suppress their suffering, they know how to challenge themselves in the face of danger and difficulty. And obviously in the role of a soldier, that is of considerable importance. However, when it comes to seeking care, that strategy can sometimes be quite disruptive and undermining because it leaves people coping with symptoms and difficulties when it's really quite unnecessary. And so I think one of the major challenges is how you allow people to develop a sense of compassion and kindness for themselves. And I think one of the great tests is, well, what would you say to a friend or somebody who you knew well who was suffering what you were suffering? I think that is the challenge, is that people often have a much higher bar for themselves than they do for others. And the issue is to how to get people to hold a reflective mirror up to them. And also, I think, to realistically develop that capacity for trust of a mental health professional, somebody who you don't know, often sharing the most private and awful and difficult aspects of your life. So, these are highly understandable things. And I think if we're sensitive to these, we do much to facilitate people's passage into treatment.
So I would say thank you, Sandy, for those thoughtful comments. And now maybe we go in the reverse order, if you allow me, Bob, what you just heard from Sandy. Any comments that come to mind?
Yeah, I appreciate Sandy's reminding us in particular of the concept of battle mind. So some of you may know that a very helpful way of thinking that soldiers develop a way of thinking during war, which is to anticipate threat. And they can They train their mind in that way, and it is very effective and helpful while one is in battle. The problem is that when one comes back, one has to leave that frame. Now, if one doesn't leave that frame, you feel disconnected from the world. And I would say that battle mind is a way in which we help educating about battle mind can be a way to feel like one has created a narrative that explains how one became one way and how one becomes another, rather than feeling that one is separate from the world and feeling different. And this idea of feeling separate is a huge part of stigma. Stigma creates holes in our life narrative. It makes us not understand how we got from there to here, and we don't know how to get back. And in that sense, battle mind is one of those repair mechanisms. It's a conceptual way of working in psychotherapy and in working in groups with soldiers and others to help them develop a continuity picture of their life. Stigma creates a discontinuity in our life. So how do we return to a continuity, and in that way, again, experience that we have a trajectory on which we are on, rather than, in fact, we are separated from the direction in which we felt our life was going?
No, thank you. Let me just comment or reflect on what you just said and what I heard about self-stigma. And typically we've heard from PTSD as fear conditioning and extinction learning. Those were the drivers for a long time in our treatment models for PTSD. Now, with self-stigma and then relating that perhaps to forgiveness, could you comment on what you just said earlier about then how these two concepts may be related, Bob?
Right. So one aspect, as you're referring to, I would kind of capture in a big sense as the emotion dysregulation that occurs associated with PTSD in particular, but many of the psychiatric disorders that we know about, and the disorders associated with trauma, which are not only PTSD. And emotion dysregulation, part of our ability to calm ourselves is our ability to forgive ourselves. And we can lose the ability to forgive. I think that's specifically what Sandy was talking to when he talked about we can hold ourselves to a higher standard than we do others who we care about. When we can hold ourselves to a standard that allows us to also forgive ourselves, we can decrease the risk of being separate and devaluing ourselves for the errors, the mistakes, and at times the tragedies that we create. So that forgiveness is part of our calming mechanisms. That is a way in which we can recover from the stigma that we feel.
I'm pausing here and I'm like, okay, help. How do we do that? Maybe a few words before I give it to Rakesh and ask him a specific question about this too.
So how do we forgive ourselves? A challenge. I would say that in working in that with an individual, it is frequently establishing with them that they are still a good person. And when they can recover their sense of goodness, they can begin to feel like all is not lost. The idea of forgiving can also come from the outside. For some, that involves a religious part of life. The role of chaplains in our military in the United States can frequently include acts of forgiveness. The ability to be invited out by a friend for a beer who you feel has been avoiding you can be felt as an act of forgiveness. Or I always like to take on myself this challenge, and of course this may be unique to the United States, but elevators are settings in which people stand quietly, and they may be traveling 20, or 30 seconds or a minute in an elevator. I think it's appropriate to always say hello when you go on the elevator, and that's an act of joining with someone. And in that joining, I do have the picture that some people are feeling hidden and that I'm inviting them to come out. And that can be felt also as a forgiveness from the outside. So I encourage everybody to say hello when you ever get out an elevator, particularly if it's going 10 floors.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Now, Rakesh, may I chime you into?
I just wanted to comment on.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah, by all means.
I'd like to invite Bob for a beer the next time we can. So just
on the 10th elevator.
Yeah, during the elevator ride. But I just wanted to touch on the point about self-stigma, and I know a lot of us are also in the interest of sort of moral dilemmas and things. But I think that the moral injury aspect of it creates the self-stigma as well. I mean, we may not have had the label for it 20 years ago when we started talking about it, because forgiveness, if I'm guilty, if I'm shameful, if I did something wrong, I'm convinced, right? And quite often I find that soldiers, veterans, leaders, subordinates show more kindness to somebody else that's in the exact same situation as they're in. Like if you're able to give them a scenario, if somebody else did this, what would you say? But they have trouble showing to themselves. And the same thing that we see with victims of childhood abuse when they've grown up. They're very hard on their 8-year-old self. But if a little kid that was 8 across the street had this, they would be very kind. So I do believe that some of the moral injury and the guilt and the shame contributes to the self-stigma. I don't think we had the word for it 20 years ago when we were talking about self-stigma, but I think that's a role as well. And it's pretty hard to forgive if you feel absolutely dirty and disgusted about what you did.
I like Rakesh's also pairing, because I would also, there's something related about forgiveness and kindness. I mean, those are some overlapping concepts that are very much involved in removing stigma.
Yeah, Najat, please.
I just want to react to 2 points regarding, this self-stigma and related to children. Sorry, this is my the way I am working, and this is the children perspective. I am thinking about this vicious, cycle that we have between self-stigma and societal stigma. I saw it with many children, because they feel, self-stigmatized, shame. They can't seek for support because they feel not well. They feel different, but also because they have in front of them also all the stigma of, the community surrounding them. And it could be families, it could be parents, it could be community, it could be media. And I think this is important regarding children, and this I saw it. I was working with children victims of violence, children on street, children poor, children, but at the same time, they stigmatize themselves and they feel very bad. But you have in front of them also this mirror that really reminds them that they are different. And I think it's really important to mix the both. If we need to change, we need to work on self-stigma, but also on the stigma related, by societal stigma in a large way. And I want to come back to forgiveness. And we are working a lot, regarding and facing many challenges regarding rehabilitation and return of children, affected and or associated, with armed groups or terrorist groups. And the big problem also is not only about self-forgiveness, but also it's the community as a whole, how we can make them forgive these children and see them as really victims of this. And it's not easy to be. It takes time to change mind, to change behavior. And I think we have a big role to really inform, to raise awareness, to explain what is it. And it's in a wording that population and communities and children themselves can understand. And this is very important. And it's not only some raising awareness campaign or one shot, it's really an ongoing way. And it is why it's important also here to involve children, to involve youth, to involve a religious leader, traditional leader, and also the professionals, because I am pediatrician and I can tell you, we also stigmatize, children who have some problem of mental health, and we have to be very careful about what we are telling. So just is more complex than that, and I think it's important what we are discussing today to see how we can build all these pieces together, because in the same time, and it will be my last point, because when you are in a poor country and where you are working on, really addressing stigma, if you have not the responses, it will be crazy, because in the same time, if you are really fighting stigma and making, children and their caregivers speaking up and seeking support, if support is not existing, it will be also very hard. And I think this is a balance we need to bear in mind, because we are not all living in Canada and in a rich country. I am coming from Morocco. I work in many poor countries. And so, sorry, there is no psychologist. There is no place when you can seek support. And this is amazing. And even all these psychological trauma are not duly recognized, by some physician, but also by justice, by teacher. And I think we need to invest in the front line human being who are facing this person, but also using children and adults who were victims of this trauma to become, strong and to show that they are human beings, they have dignity, and we need really to see them as partners, as equal. And this is really important as a part of the society. Over to you.
Yeah, Bob, you wanted to comment
Just wonderful comments by Najat about the issues of how do we change all those elements of our society separate from delivery of mental health care. Wonderful talking about teachers. I mean, if teachers, whether that's teachers of young children or for our soldiers returning back, colleges and universities, how they are accepted back into the education community. Tremendously different now than, say, after the Vietnam War in the United States, which was noted for its tremendous stigmatizing of returning soldiers, and how different that is this time around. And that in part is the education of our systems and how they are substantially different. How do we change how teachers see children? How do we change how professors see returning soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, or firefighters or EMTs? We should acknowledge the stigma and difficulties that they have as well in multiple settings in which they can hold themselves to blame for not having saved someone, or for having saved someone who afterwards ends up with terrible injuries, and that they worry about, did they do the right thing? The issues of stigma and trauma span beyond our military, of course.
Well, thank you. Maybe Rakesh, if I may entertain maybe another level to this, or another corner or angle to this, is the stigma that may be surrounding novel treatments. Or do you want to comment on this first? Maybe we'll
I think I love the discussion, and I think the societal stigma, self-stigma, depending on the model that you believe. I mean, self-stigma is actually when somebody internalizes societal stigma. So absolutely, you can't fix one without the other. They go hand in hand. I think the idea of public stigma that results in discrimination, to some extent, not it's all about us, but as psychiatric practitioners, we face stigma as well. How other physicians see us, how people in the community see us. And there have been lots of films, Hollywood and otherwise, that really depict, mental professionals as being somewhat evil. So I think there's a stigma that we face. I think there's stigmas and discrimination against effective treatments, perhaps like ECT. Full disclosure, both of us are sort of exploring, psychedelic medicine and what it offers. But then again, there's discrimination against some of these drugs, these medicines that are coming. So I think part of the idea of sort of prejudice and isms against certain things. When I was a young family doc, so, later on when I went to psychiatry, I remember talking to some of the med techs that were with me, and they said, "Oh, geez, we were so sad to see that you went into psychiatry because we felt that we had lost a good doctor." Right. And so I think there are discriminations against mental illness, the treatment of mental illness. Again, going back to my earliest comment, is these are barriers to care, right? And if people have this reluctance to go forward, and there's a prejudice against that, and if the ward we get is the dirtiest ward on the hospital, if the wing of the hospital we get is the creaky old one that was built in the 1890s, I think some of these things continue to perpetuate a discrimination against mental health help seeking, and become a barrier to care.
Thank you. And also mentioning these novel treatments and the stigma that may be around a shift in a paradigm, moving from one orientation, maybe the cognitive one, to the interdisciplinary that is more spiritual or existentially driven, and that I hear you speak to as
Yeah,
well.
well, I think, and I think Sandy put it well in his first clip. I mean, we are understanding, if we go back to the PTSD, the idea that it's not all in the mind, right? There's inflammation, there's brain changes, there's body changes, more heart disease. So we do need to sort of stop this mind-body duality. Also creates a stigma and a separation, as Bob put so well. So we separate and isolate these diseases into a box, and then we're unable to treat them effectively. And then we start to perpetuate the idea that these illnesses are chronic, nobody's ever going to get better. And so I think a lot of it comes from stepping back and taking a non-biased view and actually looking and studying what exactly is going on inside the body and mind, which is really the same thing.
So in the Netherlands, it was for a long time, it was if you had PTSD, then you would lose your job because you were not fit to serve and you were not fit for deployment. That was the reason why some people said, let's put it under the drawer or in the drawer or shove it up or cognitively avoid talking about it. That has now changed because we have effective treatments.
Yeah.
And as the general said, we now can quote unquote cure if we're early enough to treat patients with PTSD, which opens the door to stay in service and sustain your profession.
Absolutely.
We have highly trained individuals who then can keep their profession. Any comments on how we have moved to seeing PTSD as a debilitating disorder that you would not get treatment for, to a disorder that as you are early enough?
I think to tie it back to, so yes, treatment is important, but again, to tie it back to the topic of stigma is it's a label. Right? So all labels have qualifications, right? And so if we focus on treatment and then look at functioning as opposed to the diagnosis. So in Canada, we have redeployed an amputee back into Afghanistan. So depending on the job, he can work with a below-knee amputation in theater. And that's based on whether or not he can function or she can function. And likewise, the same thing with PTSD. It's let's look at the functioning afterwards. Let's not make a decision based on the diagnosis. And of course, treatment can optimize functioning. You still may have good days and bad days, but it doesn't mean that for the rest of your life, you're completely disabled based on a label.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo something that I'm reading here from General Dallaire and read a quote that he posted to us. He said, let me see if I read that. I wanted to thank you. Oh, a quote to General Dallaire. I wanted to thank you for your comments about the hell experienced and endured by military families of injured soldiers. As an ex-military spouse whose marriage ended as a direct result of the hell of moral injury, as well as a stigma that kept me trapped there and limited my ability to share my experience while I was there, I appreciate the acknowledgement of my reality. I noticed that the military family spouse experience of military mental injury is absent from this much needed conversation. Just an echo of one of the panelists that referred. And there was one question from somebody in the audience. Could Bob, and we have a couple of minutes before we end this session, Bob, could you expand upon how leaders can give forgiveness? Leaders can give forgiveness. What does that look like? Well, we elaborated on a little bit. Could you say a few words about that? That's a question from the audience, from Jeff Biddiscombe.
Sure. The role of leadership in recovery from trauma is a central piece for any organization. But let me note, everyone is a leader somewhere. A leader of your family, a leader perhaps in the school where your children are, or maybe you're the leader on the basketball or baseball team. Or soccer. Let's speak a little more globally. How a leader approaches a problem and how they speak about it sets the frame for how the community will speak. So does the leader recognize grief when it happens? In which case the person doesn't have to hide their sadness. Does the leader recognize achievement when that achievement may be done by someone who wasn't able to do an A, but did more than anyone else in terms of their heart being in it? So how they give rewards, how they give recognition, how they acknowledge sadness, and how they approach and maintain the cohesion of the unit, keeping all together rather than having pockets in which people separate out. Those are all leadership tasks.
This calls for, as the general sometimes refers to this as engaged leadership.
Great phrase. Yes.
Yeah. Another question from the panel. Thank you, Bob. Another question from Carolina Chavez. I would like to hear the panel's opinion on those drugs that are intended to, in a way, quote unquote, reset soldiers who have moral injuries so that they can go back to combat almost immediately. Would you consider them unethical and perhaps even inhumane? Rakesh, you wanted to comment on that question?
I'm not sure what drugs there are that would reset soldiers and return them back. The treatment of PTSD in my mind is, psychotherapy and medication if necessary, and the cornerstone is psychotherapy. So it's complicated when people get injured, and they certainly have a say when they're fit to return. It's not the doctors that necessarily have that say, but I'm not aware of what drugs.
Well, there are these drugs that we call reset drugs that are not given to send them back to the theater, but that we give or are being explored exactly years later down the line, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's it. But I don't know if we have medication that we give to people to send them back. I don't think that's been the purpose. I think soldiers' identity is often linked to their work, and the first role of a health system is to help people to recover and carry on in their chosen profession. Sadly, quite often with PTSD, we realize that's not possible, but we continue to help them to function in life, with society, with family.
I would add too that because we want to recognize what being a service member means. All service members, in my experience the terror and hate of war. The idea that one kills is hated by soldiers, and yet they're able to do it when they have to. We aren't removing the sense that the value is in sustaining life when one treats a soldier with PTSD. We're trying to limit the way in which it has devastated them. Psychotherapy doesn't make memories go away. It quiets them and allows you to put them on the shelf so you can take them down and read that book whenever you want, rather than having that book open all the time. So it'd be a mistake to think that in treating the sense of moral injury, one's removing the sense of the moral values that one experiences and sustains, but in many ways makes them more capable of, in fact, operationalizing those values.
Thank you, Bob. Maybe a question to Najat. How would that apply to child soldiers?
I think I already respond to this question regarding child soldiers, because you put them under militarian, and I think we have to be very careful about what we are selling. We are speaking currently more about children in armed conflict, that are affected, and to see them also as victims and not only as perpetrators. But I think it's important. We discuss a lot since we start, and I think it is dedicated to militarian and all this stigma. But I think we need maybe to make it more, to widen it. Why? Because PTSD is the result of various factors, and not only within the militarians that were, confronted to in Afghanistan, in Iraq, but also the civilians impacted because they are spouse of the militarian, but also because they are living in these countries. So if we need to move forward and really to have a strong mobilization and a strong leadership, we need to work all together, regarding this PTSD and other trauma that impact the militarian who were sent to defend, the civilian. And in the same time, they are facing many things. When we saw what happens in Afghanistan last time, it's a pity. And I think it's really important for us to move forward and to have it as a block, because we cannot oppose only that to that. The civilian are impacted. And when I'm speaking about the civilian, it's also the family of the military and people we are speaking of, but also the people who are living in the country is, and mainly children. I think it's really important to have, it's a specific approach to make sure that they are seen as victims, to start thinking about what we are calling rehabilitation, because it's not very well working, and to see how we are taking into account that. I never forget one child I discussed with, and he was involved, you know, in Iraq, and he was involved because their parents were killed by the terrorist groups, and he was trained, you know, to see only killing. He was sexually exploited many times, and he was very young, and telling how we can change our mind, how I can see myself normal. I was only used to the death and to violence. So I think we have to be very careful about, you know, when we are speaking about children, it's a specific approach, but it's also built on this continuum between the military and the civil, and to make sure that when we are dealing with PTSD and regarding stigma, we have to make sure that we are having a strong movement with a strong leadership at not only within the wealth countries, but also the poor countries. Over to you.
Well, let me return to you. I'm just calling into some help from Suzette that typically summarizes all the comments that have been made during this panel, but I would like to turn back to you. We're getting to a close, and maybe in like 30 seconds, maybe max a minute, can we circle to the panelists to say, hey, what are the highlights that should not be forgotten? And you may summarize or add a new element that you haven't shared to maximize the message to the audience that is with us today. And let me, in the order that we started out with, Najat, what are the last words that you would like to share with the audience on this topic?
Yes, very shortly. Children are already victims of PTSD and other many forms of mental health issues, not only because they are involved, you know, in armed conflict, but because they are victims of various forms of violence in many settings, including in humanitarian settings. But also, they are wonderful experts and has to be seen as part of the solution. Nothing can be done without making sure and mainly fighting stigma and breaking stigma if children and young people are not involved. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for those words. Let's go to Rakesh. Rakesh, what are your last words after today?
No, I think thank you for this great platform. It really feels great. I think it's a journey. I'm optimistic. I think as society evolves, I mean, you and I both have children in their teens and 20s, and I just look at how society to a large extent is becoming more tolerant, more open, certainly in our Western countries. And I just think that the idea of going to see a shrink or seeing a doctor or admitting to mental illness is getting easier and easier and easier, and our militaries will echo that. So I think we're by no means done, but I think having been around for sort of 30 years in this space, I think we're moving in the right direction, and we just need to continue to do so. So optimism is for me.
Optimism. Thank you. Thank you. We'll underscore that, Rakesh. Bob, what are your last words that you'd like to share with us?
I think we need to do more with how do we remove stigma rather than how do we define it. And so I very much like the image that came to mind, which is see people and talk to them at their level. And then secondly, I liked what I was reminded of when Rakesh was speaking about there's something about kindness that is involved in the act of forgiveness and being kind, teaching people to be kind to oneself, and sometimes being kind to someone else can be experienced as a forgiveness that allows them to return to the community that they were part of.
Thank you for sharing it. I was not aware at the beginning of this panel that the word forgiveness has been embraced by almost all panelists. And it is a sort of a novel concept that has been brought to our minds that is related to stigma. And I think that we'll hear and we'll need to learn much more about it, what it is and how to deal with it. And I thank you from my perspective. We're getting at the top of the hour for all your wisdom and your rich comments reflecting on each other. This is exactly what we had in mind event when we wondered about a critical conversation webinar. So in the honor of the General Romeo Dallaire, thank you, Rakesh and Najat and Bob and Sandy for sending us his video. And I'd like to give it to Suzette to close this session and to set it up for the next one, which will be tomorrow, Suzette.
Exactly. It's truly an amazing discussion, conversation. Thank you to each of the panelists and to you, Eric, for moderating. So all a brilliant conversation, brilliant moderation. Wonderful to listen to and give some critical thought to, destigmatizing the impact of trauma and PTSD from multiple perspectives. Certainly the child soldier perspective, and keeping in mind all that Najat said, the key focuses, and I'm not going to repeat, they were brilliantly done already by the panelists. We're looking forward to our two final sessions. So in closing, we want to remind people about the session planned for tomorrow, October 28th, on re-envisioning leadership. And that will be before our final session on November 10th on the pathway forward. Eric, I'd like to invite you to tell people a little bit about who will be joining us tomorrow on the 28th. So I'm thinking about starting with Dr. Chelsea Jones. I'll introduce her and maybe you can take over the other two. So Chelsea Jones, an occupational therapist with Veterans Affairs Canada at Edmonton's Operational Stress Injury Clinic and a postdoctoral fellow at Leiden University Medical Center with Eric Vermetten and with Highmark at the University of Alberta, where she works with with trauma-affected populations and novel interventions. Eric, the other two.
Yeah, and we have with us Roxanne van Iperen, a Dutch writer and journalist who focuses on genocide, power dynamics, and victim complicity, who in the Netherlands wrote a beautiful book on, it's called The Genocide Facts, that was received wonderfully in the Netherlands, and she received many compliments about that production. And she'll be with us tomorrow as well, as is Mr. James Tuck-Mathier. He's an entrepreneur, a founder, and executive director of the Rainmaker X Enterprise, and a burgeoning leader and advocate in high-level international discussions on trade for inclusive and sustainable growth. As I said, you'll tell us who will be moderating the session of tomorrow.
It's my pleasure to let people know that Dr. Lorraine Smith McDonald will be moderating the session tomorrow. She's a postdoctoral fellow with us at the University of Alberta and the Heroes in Mind Advocacy and Research Consortium that's supporting this series with Eric and the Dallaire Institute. Lorraine is a clinician scientist and expert in mental health, trauma, and spirituality. So we have a brilliant lineup for tomorrow, and then certainly for our final session on November 10th. So
and thanks again. Thanks again for the panelists of today. Can't express my gratitude, and also on behalf of the General who shared his thoughts, and Suzette, for my dear friend Rakesh Jetly, Najat, Maalla, Majid. Thank you so much for your passion and your wisdom that you shared with us. And Bob, same goes for you, Bob Ursano. Wonderful to hear you speak with your wisdom and the beautiful vignettes and the richness that you shared with us and the audience. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure, guys. Thank you.